All right. We'll get started this morning. Right now, I'm thinking, I'm just going to throw this out there, see what you all think, but I'm thinking maybe February-ish. I got to figure out what's going on. So I got to ask around some questions. But what for our activity for February, I'm thinking we'll do a chili cook-off with a game night, maybe.
I can't.
So, well, those of us that can, I can. But now this is where this.
Rude.
What?
That's horrible timing for them to break out laughing.
I'm telling you, isn't it? It's horrible. But knowing them, especially that one on the end and that in the middle back there. But anyway, like I said, we may try to do something like that. I know Darla can cook. We all know Darla can cook. And then I can try. I'm usually pretty good. Chili's not my strong point, but I'll give it my best shot. If not, if nothing else, I'll just submit my mother-in-law's as mine. You can't do that because I didn't call it. But anyway, like I said, that's just something I'm kind of thinking about right now. Just because it'll be kind of cold, and of course it'll get dark early and stuff, so we could just come in and I was thinking about trying another Family Feud night, but we may do trivia. So I'm kind of bouncing back and forth between those two. So because at our last, yes, it was, but we kind of got a hint at our last at the Christmas light tour. About everybody versus the Browns in trivia. So yes. I don't know. I'm kind of curious to see how that would play out, and then also with the Family Feud because it was fun and.
John would be great to have on your trivia team. I will give him that.
Well, hell, y'all might have some competition.
No.
No. That was a quick no.
Not on my end. I've lived with those two long enough. I'm convinced there's like an abyss within their brains of just useless information that no one needs to know. It's quite impressive, actually. I don't know where it comes from, but it's
incredibly backhanded compliment.
That's kind of cool.
It really was a backhanded compliment.
You know a whole bunch of information no one needs to know.
I do too, dude. Never mind.
So, like I said, that's kind of what I'm thinking, and we'll kind of I'll keep you informed and everything else once I figure out who I need to talk to about what's going on in February, because I'm sure it'll be posted online before long, because the first of the year is just like 2 weeks away. So, anyway, so we're still in our study about the Backsliders roadmap back to God over in the book of Jeremiah, chapter number 6. We're still looking at verse number 16. So Jeremiah 6 and verse 16 says, "Thus saith the Lord, stand ye in the ways and see and ask for the old paths. Where is the good way, and walk therein, and ye shall find rest for your souls. But they said, we will not walk therein." And of course, in this we were, the first week we looked at this, we kind of took an extended amount of time and discussed how the parallels between Israel's walk with the Lord back in this time when Jeremiah was recording this, and we kind of paralleled that to how America's walk has kind of mirrored their walk. One, at some point in time, they're really close to God. Then there's other times where they're not. And just the ebbs and flows, how even for the majority, the Christian, how our lives oftentimes mimic the ups and downs of the nation of Israel. So that's kind of what we talked about in the first week. Now, last week we got into talking about standing, and we discussed the benefits to simply standing still. How easy it is to get carried away with busyness, and how oftentimes we operate daily on autopilot, which brings us to our scripture that I've got down here supporting it. But before we get there, like I said, standing in the ways, we talked about how to stand is to be still, and how when we stop what we're doing, when we kind of slow down, we can kind of start taking in what all's going on around us and everything else. I mean, I'm just a little personal thing here. I tend to be a little bit more detail oriented. I notice a lot of things. I'll pay attention to some, like Madison's backhanded comment to you. I tend to notice some things that a lot of people don't notice. I mean, just like, and if that giggle box gets turned over, we're doomed. Okay, we might as well shut it down. But anyway, like I said, that's just something that I've always done. I've always been able to pick up on things, not bragging on myself, but it's just kind of obscurely that I have noticed that. But in the same vein of discussion, when we get so wrapped up in what's going on around us, we often lose sight of where we are within ourselves in our walk with the Lord. We get so busy with things going on outside that a lot of times something's always going to give in our lives, whether it's the relationships that we have with different people or whatever. If our, we talked about how a lot of times, with school and people that we work with, when we no longer work at these places, we often lose contact. How when we've graduated school, we'll often lose contact with a lot of people that we went to school with and everything else, which is one reason why social media has took off like it has, is it's a way to stay in contact but not in contact. So, we're able to see what's going on in the lives of people that we know, we care about, but that we don't have the actual time to stop, drive to wherever it is they are and go see them. You can kind of keep in contact and stuff like that. But when we slow down in our Christian life, a lot of times it allows us to see just where we are in our walk with the Lord. So that, and with that is the first verse I was wanting to kind of look at. And you'll find this in Exodus 14:3. You don't have to turn there, and I'll read it to you. It says, "And Moses said unto the people," now this is dealing with when the nation of Israel is coming out of Egyptian bondage. And they're going through the wilderness, and they're being chased by the Egyptians. And verse number 13 of Exodus 14 says, "And Moses said unto the people, Fear not, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will show you today. For the Egyptians whom you have seen." Now I like that word seen. It's in the past tense. Now this is present, but Moses is already looking into victory, and he says, "As you've seen." He's done talking about them in past tense. Today ye shall see them again no more forever. And of course, if you know the story, this is when Moses parts the Red Sea. The nation of Israel walks across on dry ground. A lot of people try to explain that miracle away, saying, well, they really didn't walk across on dry land. They walked across in the shallow part and everything, which is even more amazing because the Bible tells us that the walls of water came crashing down on top of the Egyptian army, and they all drowned. So for the Egyptian army, which was massive, horses, chariots, and men to all drown in ankle-deep water, that's an even bigger miracle than the miracle that the Bible records, which I honestly believe it was parted. They walked across on dry ground. God brought the water down, drowned them all. And they have done archaeological underwater digs and found horse remains, chariot remains, human remains in the area where they shouldn't be if what the Bible tells us actually happened hadn't have happened. They wouldn't be there. But we know that the Bible is true. We've proved it within ourselves. So, as we said, when Moses, these people, they're running, they're busy, they're complaining, they're scared, and then Moses tells them just to stand still. And when they stopped and they stood still, they got to see God do something miraculous for them. And a lot of times that's the way it is with us. When we get to that point to where we're just running, we're just constantly moving, we're constantly going in different directions, being pulled here, being pulled there, and everything else. When we get to that point to where we just stop and say, okay, Lord, I'm stopping. When we get to that point in our lives, a lot of times, we get to see where we are, and that's what we're fixing to talk about next. But we'll see that, but where we are, we'll get our senses will be heightened to the point to where we'll know what direction God's trying to pull us in, God's trying to lead us in and direct us in. A lot of times, I've always heard that when it comes to the will of God, God's never going to lay the roadmap out. He's never going to lay it out in front of you. You're not going to find out a lot of times God's path for your life until you're right in the middle of His will. And that's just the way God works. God can put something on your heart, lead you to a certain point, but then it's up to you and me to go with that, to put that faith that we have in Him into action and put boots to the ground and start moving in that direction. And once we start following what we believe God is leading us to, we will find we're in the middle of God's will. So as we see, that's what happens when we stop and stay still. Then we talked about the movement stops. We're able to see different things. And then for that, if you would turn over to the book of 1 Kings chapter number 19, and I'll have to actually look this one up with you, because this was a late addition this morning when I was sitting there studying this. But in 1 Kings chapter number 19 is dealing with Elijah. 1 Kings, we'll pick up in verse number 9, and I got to turn back one more page. And it says, "And he came thither unto a cave and lodged there. And behold, the word of the Lord came unto him, and he said unto him, What doest thou here, Elijah? And he said, I have been very jealous for the Lord God of hosts, for the children of Israel have forsaken thy covenant, thrown down thine altars, and slain thy prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left. And they seek my life to take it away. And he said, Go forth and stand upon the mount before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great strong wind rent the mountains and brake in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice. And it was so, when Elijah heard it, that he wrapped his face in his mantle, went out, and stood, there that word is again, stood in the entering in of the cave. And behold, there came a voice unto him, and said, What doest thou here, Elijah? And of course, this is just a repeat of the first part of the conversation that we just read about. But when we get to that point to where in our busyness, we get to that point in our Christian life to where we're just running here, running there, doing this, doing that. It's when we get in that time to where we just stop and we stand still. That's when we're going to find how far we are away from God, or how far we've come with God. And even if we are walking the path that God has for us, and we're finding ourselves in the middle of His will, like we talked about a second ago, a lot of times it does us good when we're in that point to get to that point where we just stop, stand still, take account of everything going on around us. And if we're finding ourselves in God's will and we're not backing up on God, we're not backsliding, we're not moving away from Him, a lot of times it does us good to get to that point to take a inventory of what all's going on around us, what God's doing for us in our life, and everything else. And if nothing else, just give Him thanks for what He's doing for us, with us, and through us, and then continue on with Him. So when we get to that point of stand, it's good. That's what it's in that time that we see God actually move and work in our life. Now, our next one we want to take a look at, it says, and see. The Bible, we find this back in our text verse. It says, thus saith the Lord, stand ye in the ways and what? See. We put vision with this. In this step, we can evaluate where we're going. We are either walking with God or we're backing up on God. And a lot of times that's what we're talking about. When we get to that point of standing, we can see where we're going. But we have to be willing to see. How many of you know people that you either work with, went to school with, or whatever, you could see something going on in their life that was not good, but they themselves couldn't see it because they didn't want to? Anybody ever had that experience? A lot of times when we're in that point, we don't want to see just how bad our situation is. A lot of times for the Christian that's backsliding on God, they'll get so far removed from where He is and from where He's wanting us to go and from where we've been, that a lot of times we'll get so far away from Him, we don't want to admit or see just how far we've walked away from Him. You'll find that in a lot of times in your friendships with fellow Christians. I mean, a lot of times we can see people. I mean, it's like the preacher says, a lot of times before somebody leaves the church, they've already left the church. That's what happens when someone's faithful Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night. Then the next thing you know, they start missing a few Sunday or Wednesday nights. Starts off, Wednesday night's not that important. You know, I had this come up, I had that come up. This has pulled me over here for a little bit, job, whatever it is, and everything else. And then it comes down to the next thing you know, they're missing Sunday night. Then the next thing you know, it's a Sunday morning or two here and there. And before you know it, they're completely and totally out. It's like, I mean, just kind of a story. A pastor came to see a man that was in his church. And the man hadn't been to church in quite some time. And he come in and they're talking. And he's asking him, you know, how things is going and everything else. And they're talking about the Lord and everything else. And the man just kind of makes a statement, you know, that he doesn't feel like he really needs to be in church to stay in fellowship with God. And the pastor, well, you know, I understand. And he sees in the fire, he sees the fire, it's got some coals down on the bottom that's glowing red hot. And he takes the tongs and he reaches in and he's messing with the fire and he picks one up and brings it out and just sets it right on the hearth. Lays the tongs down and they just kind of sat there. And it wasn't long that hot coal that the pastor had pulled out of the fire started to lose its heat. Instead of being bright orange, it started getting a dingy orange. Then it started turning, then as it continued to cool, it started turning black. And they just sat there and watched that ember kind of fade off into cold. And the man knew the Lord had spoke to him because of that. And that's what happens a lot of times. When we start forsaking the house of God, when we start putting less emphasis on the church, that's what happens a lot of times is that once we'll get out of the fire and we'll start getting cold on God. And that's a lot of times what we as individuals, we don't want to see ourselves, because we know where we've been. We know the victories we've had in our life and everything else. But all that ember has to do is to get back in the fire, and it'll pick up the heat. It'll pick up its glow. It'll pick up right where it left off and everything else. So, and the pastor picked it up, put it back in there, and that's exactly what happened with that ember. So, like I said, when we get to that point, we start seeing where we are. When we stop and we start taking account of everything going on in our life, and first off, you have to be honest with yourself. You know, if someone we know is battling with this and we're trying to help them, a lot of times you kind of have to help, like that pastor did with that church member that hadn't been there. Just a simple little thing like that helped visualize that was him. He was in the fire when he was faithful to church. But then when he got out of the fire, when he stopped coming to church, for a time, he was still close to God. He was still living on the victories of his past. But as time continued to go, he started cooling down. The ember started cooling down. And the victories of the past become less and less important and less of a driving force, because as you know, if you're not moving forward with God, you're backing up on Him. God's going to continue to move. If we fall out of fellowship with Him, we're staying here, and God continues to move forward. He's not going to stop for anybody. Not you, not me, not the pastor, nobody. Because if we decide to walk away from Him, He's still got His plan. He's still moving forward with what He's got in store. We can get back in that fellowship and get back to where we were. But it's going to take some time to do so. So when we see where we're at, it's also in this step, we need to be willing to examine ourselves and be honest with ourselves where we are in our walk. We have to be able to see ourselves as we truly are, just like at the time of our salvation. As we all know, we're good Christians. We know that at some point in time, when we got to the point to where we accepted Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior of our lives, we had to see ourselves as a lost person in need of the free gift of salvation in what God had done for us on the cross. We had to get to that point. We had to become honest with ourselves. The same thing is true when it comes to getting out of God's will and trying to get back in His will. You have to be honest. Honesty is always the best policy. We've heard that our whole lives, have we not? Going all the way back to grade school, even at home when it comes to mom and dad, the best thing a lot of times to do is just to own up and be honest. Yeah, it may bring some consequences along with it, but a lot of times it's going to be a lot better if we are honest than if we wasn't. If you ever found yourself on the bad side of a situation with your parents or a teacher or anything else. I mean, I've been in both places. You know, I'm kind of speaking from experience here. And that's the one thing that I tried my best to instill in my two kids back there, that to be honest is the best policy. Don't lie to me. Just be honest. And they've been fairly fairly okay, fairly good at that. But it still comes down to the simple point that, if you start lying to people, people are going to find out. God knows you're not going to lie to God. He knows exactly where you're at. He knows exactly what you're going through. He knows exactly everything about us. But when it comes to other people, we can fool a lot of people. I mean, I've fooled a lot of people in my past. I know, shocking, right? But it still comes down to the fact that when it comes, I might could have fooled a lot of people even in this church. I didn't fool God. God knew what was going on in my heart. He knew what was going on in my life. But I still had to get to that point to where I was honest with Him and just lay it all out there and make things right between me and Him. And once we get to that point, and once we help someone get to that point, then we're able to help restore that person back into fellowship with the Lord. Which is also, as much as, spreading the gospel, as much as going out and trying to evangelize and tell our friends and family and people we come into contact with about God, the other thing is that we're also responsible to help one another. As we talked about, I'm pretty sure it was over in the book of Galatians 6. Let me try to get my pages to unstick here. Galatians 6. No, well, it might help if I was in 6. Yep, Galatians 6:1 says, "Brethren, if a man be overtaken in a fault, you which are spiritual, restore such a one in the spirit of meekness, considering thyself, lest also thou shalt be tempted. Bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ." Like I said, it comes down to, as important as it is for us to try to help people come to the saving knowledge of Jesus Christ, it's also important for us that are spiritual, that haven't gotten away from God, that hasn't walked away, or those of us that have and found our way back. That's a ministry that we can help others find their way back to God. And that's kind of the driving point of this lesson that we're looking at here, is to help others. We need to be mindful of ourselves, but there's also the same point of helping others too, helping others along the way, being willing to. Now, obviously, when it comes to that, just like with anything else, whether it's alcoholism or anything like that, that person has to be willing to seek help. You're not going to be successfully forcing someone into a rehab anywhere and it stick with them if they're not to the point to where they realize they need to help themselves. But that's where we come in. We're living the life that God has called us to live. And we're shining that light that He has instilled in us. And we're coming into contact with these people who may be cold, who may have indifferent, who may not, we know that used to go to church, that don't go to church anymore, and everything else. As we come into contact with these people that we know, or however we're acquainted with them, whether it be family, work, school, whatever, as we come into contact with these people, if they're able to see the light of God in us, just as a lost person needs to see the same light, if they're experiencing, we're able to take the power of God in our lives to them, it's going to cause them to want to, or it should cause them to want to get back into fellowship with God themselves. But it takes us living in that power and having the power of God on our life. And that's not easy. That's not easy to do daily. It's easy to have the power of God on you, here and there and everything else, because there's a lot of things that go into that. I mean, as we all know, we're all sinners. We sin daily. To say you don't sin is a lie, and you've just sinned. But it's up to us to keep our lives to a point to where God can use us at the drop of a hat. I mean, you can come into contact with someone, and if it's somebody God's been dealing with that we don't know about, God can use our life at that particular moment if we're at a point to where He can use us. The power of God can come on our lives, and the power of God in our lives can testify to the Spirit that is longing for that power that is present in our lives. It can ignite something in that person to want to seek God again. It ain't coming in and fussing and griping and telling somebody you need to get right with God and everything else. No, you just need to come in, be their friend, be there for them, encourage them, talk about God a little bit. Don't be overbearing, but that's how that spirit of meekness can help others come back to God. And we see that in Psalms chapter 119, verses 105, it says, "Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path." As we're taking our life, when we see where we are, when these people see where they're at, they're going to realize that the only way back is through the Word of God. They're going to see the fact that someone cares enough about them to want to see them get back into fellowship with the Lord. Just as a lot of times it takes the drug addict or the addict out there, and whatever it is, it takes that addict to need to see the fact of where they're at in their life to want to change the direction of their life. The same thing is true with a backslidden Christian. They have to get to the point to where they see the need of God in their life. They see how far they've gotten away from God. And that's where the light of our testimony, the light of our life, can help them see just exactly that. So as we see here, Jeremiah's telling us, stand in the ways and see. Now next week we'll look at the next part where it says, and ask. And ask. That's the first step that requires an action back in the steps. The first two, as we see, stand and see, that's dealing with just the individual, whether it's us or someone we know that we're trying to witness to or live a life in front of, to point them back into fellowship with God. As they get to that point, they're going to have to stand and see and take account to where they're at. That's where we come in. That's where we help them. Or we ourselves. A lot of times, like I said, it don't take much. How many of you ever seen somebody just barely trip and then they're running down the hallway trying to not fall flat on their face? It didn't take much for them to start stumbling. It's the same way it is with our walk with God. It don't take much. One little toe kick. The carpet reaches up and grabs the toe of your shoe, and here you go stumbling, and then you're running trying not to fall. That's what happens a lot of times in our lives when it comes to stumbling in our walk with God. It doesn't take much. Just one little something. You've heard an old statement that says, one bad apple spoils a bunch, or it doesn't take much to upset someone's apple cart. One little bump, that's all it takes. We're that close. A lot of times we don't even realize it. I haven't ever realized just how close I have been a lot of times to just completely and totally messing and wrecking my life up. But it happens. But a lot of times we can find our way back. God gives us help. His word helps us. That's what we're looking at right here. So as we see, the Backsliders roadmap back to God. Next week we'll look at the next part, like I said, and ask. All right, you are free to go because the first bell's done rung.